Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Friday. It's the commencement of a weekend. And that means Friday reads and weekend reading reports and reading updates that some booktubers do on a weekly basis as a kind of, meet at the pub check-in for the state of your reading at the moment. What have you been reading lately? What are you currently reading? What's on your docket for the immediate future and why? What are you thinking about it all? I've always had a weird relationship with Friday reads on BookTube. For the longest time, I told myself, and I also highfalutinly told you, that I couldn't do Friday reads because A, it would cover too many books, it would be too long a video, and B, a lot of the stuff that I'm reading, I am commissioned to review. I'm commissioned to write about it elsewhere. And I'm sorry if it seems old-fashioned, but to me, if you're writing about a book, you don't talk about it until long after the fact. You don't double dip. I should have known that those reasons weren't actually watertight. I do a lot of reading. This week, for instance, I've done a huge amount of reading. A huge amount. It is the first quibble that I had about Friday reads is definitely true. I can't sit here and go through every book that I've read this week, especially since a lot of them would not be of interest. Trust me on that. But as for reviewing, I can easily tiptoe around the books that I'm going to review and still have plenty to talk about. I could, after the reviews have run, do a whole video about stuff that I have reviewed. So Friday reads are entirely possible for me, and it allows me to get in on the fun. I wish that everybody did a Friday update of some kind, a weekend update of some kind or other. I have a suspicion that the reason a lot of people don't is because they don't feel like they've made enough progress, which is dead wrong as a way of thinking. That is dead wrong. We are all here to listen to the people. We don't want a steady bracket of new information. I'm going to give you a steady bracket of new information because I do nothing but read, though. And this week, I've read a lot. A very large amount, even for me. But I want to go through a few of those books and talk about them just a bit with you. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there are any books on this list, once again, that I have not read. And I always tell myself beforehand, make sure to add some books that are coming up. And then I don't do it. Then I don't remember to do it. I'm not sure if I did that this time around, but if you're wondering which books are coming up, just look at my mail hauls, because those are the books that are coming up. My mail hauls or Brattle hauls, those as well. But anyway, the first book, I have a cover here, but it's not the version that I read. This is the only cover that I can find online. This is an English language translation by Phyllis Lyons of In Black and White by Tanizaki. A very strange and slippery novel of his in which a writer starts to have incredibly obsessive worries about something that he has just printed and plots a murder because of it. But is he plotting a murder? And is the person he's plotting to murder actually real? It's very, I don't want to use the word surreal because that is overused, but it is a slippery book. Masterfully controlled. Just masterfully controlled. It must have been something of a nightmare to write, and I can only imagine what kind of a nightmare it is to translate. But I'm holding this up, but this is not the translation that I read this week. The translation I read this week is a new translation, brand new. I think only this book's second English language translation, and not commercially available, but I know the translator, and the translator wanted me to, I don't read Japanese. The translator wanted me to know, how does this read as a book? And also, the new translator wanted me to compare it to this one because I know this one kind of well. And that was fun. That was a fun exercise. I took innumerable exchanged emails. I don't even know how many. But so this was one of the books that I read this week, but it's not going to have this title. And it isn't this translation. I did, of course, go back and reread this translation, which I thought was quite good. The new translation that I read, which may see the light of day in 2025 or something like that, the new translation was different in a lot of ways, and also bigger. Part of the email exchange, I know I'm being maddeningly vague here, but part of the email exchange that I had was all about the provenance of this manuscript in Japanese and in English. The story is so good that I end up not really caring. Tanizaki is great. But that was one of the things that I read. We're off to a very vague and ambiguous start. I reread the Lyons translation, yes. But I also read, the main thing I read was a new translation of this work by a young translator who is, I think, should certainly pitch this around. I don't know how that works in the translation world. I have no idea how that works. Do translators get agents like normal writers do? I don't know, but it's worth it. It's worth having an audience, so I'm hoping that it happens. And then this next one is science fiction. Vintage science fiction that I reread. I'm sure that I read this thing decades ago. This is The Blue World by Jack Vance. About the descendants of a penal ship that crash lands on a world that is almost entirely water. And as we've seen on this channel in various science fiction, the age-old science fiction gimmick, the descendants grow less and less technologically aware until finally they are maybe mid-Renaissance level in terms of worldview and also in terms of understanding of technology. They don't understand where they came from. They don't have any idea where their guilds come from, where their terminology comes from. And they live an uneasy existence on this water world, which is also inhabited by weird tentacle-type creatures that seem semi-sentient, and one of those creatures has realized that these weird bipedal creatures will feed it if it doesn't kill them. If it doesn't attack them, they'll continue to feed it. So it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and becomes a votive sacrifice for the people involved. That's part of our world, is that we feed this thing. Which, obviously, as you could tell even from that abbreviated plot summary, means that this is a fairly heavy-handed allegory of a bunch of easy things on Jack Vance's mind at the time. In some ways, this is an easy book, but I loved it. I just love this author's eloquence. I love his narrative energy, whether it's this, which I think is probably a minor work of his, or the major works of his, you always get the sense that this author is right there on the page with you. And I really like that. When I read this, I remembered almost nothing about this when I read it the second time this week. When I read it the second time, I was reminded of how irritated I am at the ambiguous ending. There's the actual ending is not ambiguous, but there's an element in the ending of this book that is ambiguous, or that was meant to be ambiguous. But I remembered, once I got to it, I remembered immediately how I thought about it the first time I read it. Under a broad, endless Midwestern sky, I thought, no, you mean that to be ambiguous, but it's not, actually. That's actually a very clear thing. You just don't think it's clear. Or maybe you think your readers won't think it's clear. So, very well done, science fiction. The only quibble that I had this time around, something I didn't think to think when I read it the first time, which is that science fiction gimmick about, 10 generations later, they don't call it orbit anymore, they call it the up above. They don't call it space anymore, they call it the vault or whatever. That wouldn't happen. that actually wouldn't happen. Not in 10 generations, not in 100 generations. That wouldn't happen. I know that so much science fiction and science fantasy is based on that, but that wouldn't happen. People would remember. The society here, all these different castes, should not exist at all. These people should have a very strong institutional memory of where they come from, even after far more generations than just the interval given in this book. But I still really enjoyed it. It was still a great old science fiction romp. Then we have modern fantasy. This is by Blake Wolf. The author's name is Blake R. Wolf. Pretty sure that's a pen name. But this was served up to me by one of those free ebook aggregator sites where you give them your email and you get that day's free ebook offerings. And this is the Grimoire of Kings. This is book 1 of the Tales of Grimoria, it's a transportation, a kind of a portal fantasy where the main character and his friends steal a book. They steal a grimoire that transports them to a fantasy world of dragons and sorcery and whatnot. That is interesting. I've only a couple of times seen it done through the method of a book instead of a wardrobe or the closet in an empty house or a manhole cover or something like that. There are 2 added elements in here for book one that made this a little more interesting than the usual. One was that the main character appears to be dying, and his friends want to, have adventures before his inevitable death. And when he's catapulted into a fantasy world, you're wondering how that aspect is going to be affected. And the other is a gay element. And the reason that there are question marks hovering all around that is because I don't think... I honestly can't tell, given the state of things in the 21st century, I can't tell if the gay element in this book was handled correctly or if it was underplayed. I can't tell which of those, because now if any aspect at all of what we lump under the heading of identity politics is in a book, you expect it to be the book's whole reason for existence. You expect it to be mentioned by every character, in every speech, even when they're falling off a cliff, on every page. So when it's not that, and it wasn't in this book, then I wonder, okay, is it me or is it you? Are you handling this correctly with discretion? Or are you underplaying this? I don't know. I'm going to need a couple more books in this series to figure that out. I did like this enough by the end to read the next book in the series. And that is where authors out there, indie authors out there, are making money off me. Because these things are served up to me for free, but if I like the reading experience, and these are never the newest book that's served up for free. These are always a couple of years old at least. I will buy the others. And I like this enough. By the time I got to the end, that's the number one question I ask myself when I'm at the end of any of these freebies is, did you like that enough to follow this author? Did you like it enough to buy the next book? And the answer here was yes. So another success for those freebie sites. This next one was also one of those things. This is by Michael Robertson, and it is New Reality, Truth. This was less successful. It was better written, I thought, than the Grimoire of Kings, but less successful in terms of maybe not even world building, but the exploitation of the world building. The world building in Grimoire of Kings is fairly simple. The world building here is not, but I'm not sure that it was exploited as much as it could. The idea here is that there's a corporation. It's not Exxon. It's Nixon. It's meant to be a kind of the stereotypical world-straddling evil corporation, and they've created a sense-around video game experience. Think of what did Apple just launch? A headset virtual reality type thing that has bugs in it, but is still, by all accounts, incredible. This game that they introduced, this alternate reality, this virtual reality that this company introduces, is all of that times a million. And the whole world has been lost to that game. Everyone is playing it to the exclusion of all else, except for our two main characters in this book, who are not in the game. And the company doesn't want anybody not to be in the game. I liked the writing here a lot. This is a talented author. I don't think I've ever encountered this author before. I didn't check to see if this was a debut. But by chapter 6 or 7, I wasn't trying to poke holes in the stories, but by chapter 6 or 7, I was persistently coming up with, okay, well, how would that work? Okay, well, there's a glaring hole here, and you can't just hand wave that away. How would that work? In any story like this, going all the way back to the granddaddy of these stories, which I believe would be that 1-2-minute sequence of explanation in The Matrix, for instance, one of the first things that my mind thinks about is a simple word: agriculture. In the scenario described in that 2-minute explanation sequence of human farming in The Matrix, none of it would work without agriculture. It wouldn't be possible. And there's no way in that scenario that there would be agriculture. Same thing here. There were a lot of things here where I was thinking, okay, but how would this actually... I know the point you're trying to make, but how would this actually work? There are times when I didn't mind. There's a pretty good little daisy chain of action sequences towards the end of this book, that are so well done, so convincing, that I didn't mind. I ended up not minding. And also the writing, like I said, is so good that I didn't mind. So here again, those freebie sites won a fan. I now have an author to watch. This next one is a translation. We saw it on this channel. Where are you going? Okay, all right, there you go. We saw it on this channel. I just thought I'd mention it. I've actually written a review of this, so this obviously betokens a way that I can rethink Friday reads. Maybe a section of my Friday read should be some of the books that I reviewed in the last week. But we've seen it on this channel. It's a new translation of the Quran by Habib and Lawrence. This is the very black, very somber dust jacket. If you remember the naked hardcover of the finished copy, once you take the somber dust jacket off, you get the great contrast of a gloriously colorful naked hardcovers on the front and back and spine. That's wonderful. And this is from the folks at Ivory, who I love. And it isn't bilingual. There's no Arabic here. So all I was going to do was read the Quran itself and maybe compare large chunks of it to a couple of other Quran translations that I have here. And I did that, thinking the whole time that I would write that review. I often do write reviews like that, where I can't read the original language, but I'm still going to show you a few translations in order so that we can compare them together and assess their strengths and weaknesses. But I was increasingly distracted from doing that by the prefatory material in this volume, in which the two translators, I think, none of the prefatory material is actually signed, but I think it's the two translators who are writing it, or certainly they want you to be able to construe that, basically say that the Quran was inspired by the Archangel Gabriel in a cave outside of Mecca and dictated to the Prophet Muhammad. And that's why it's so important. That's why it's important to do a new translation of it and for the translation to really be bouncy and peppy. Not because it's an ancient document and there's always a call for new translations of ancient documents to better reflect the time in which the translation appears, but because this is more than a book, because this is a divine revelation. This is not a divine revelation. There are no divine revelations. If it's a divine revelation, prove it. Don't just claim it in a translation. Prove it to me. Prove that there ever was a Muhammad. Prove that there ever was a Gabriel. Prove that any of this is divine. It looks fairly simple to me. Fairly straightforward 7th century Arabic writing. It doesn't seem divine to me in any way. And I don't want to have to toe that line in order to read this thing. No wonder it was bothering me the whole time. If a publisher came out with a new translation of the Book of Mormon and prefaced it by this is, or not a new translation, but that annotated that annotated Book of Mormon that came out just a couple of years ago. If the huge header material, the gist of the header material of that volume were that this is actually the inspired word of God given to Joseph Smith, I wouldn't have cared how good the translation was. I'm not going to enter the house if that's the fee at the door. I'm not going to do it. I'm also not going to trust the translation. I mean, the annotated Book of Mormon is probably a bad idea. But what about the Bible? If I encounter a new translation of the Bible, and what's happening at the beginning in the prefatory material, where the introduction and the note on translation are explaining what's going on here, if all they're doing is singing hosannas of praise, because isn't it an honor to translate the holy and inerrantly inspired word of God, I'm not going to bother with the book. Because I don't read the original languages and I'm not trusting you at all to translate them. If you're coming at it from a faith angle of this being a divinely inspired supernatural text, if you encounter anything that doesn't look that way, you might change it, for all I know. Your faith will certainly take precedence over your faithfulness to the text. And since I know that, and since you would agree with it as well, why would I bother to read your translation? I read the introduction and prefatory material here, and I let it rush off me, and I went into the translation, but that was bothering me the whole time. And then I realized why. Because I don't know if this is trustworthy or not. You're saying it's a religious document from God. It's not. So if you're wrong about that, how do I know you're right about some dangling participle somewhere? So it ended up being an extremely frustrating experience. A beautiful cover, a beautiful externals, but an extremely frustrating experience. Then this next one is a reread. This is from Oxford University Press from years ago. I found my old copy and wanted to go through it again from beginning to end. It is engrossing reading for me only. I don't imagine many other people would find it. This is The Biology and Conservation of Wild Canids. And it's outdated. It's a little bit old, and the conservation has gone from bad to worse in a lot of these cases, but from bad to better in some of them. Actually, one example of each on the cover here. The bottom example here are almost extinct. The top example is experiencing a renaissance in urban living. And you get everything in between here. And it's very technical, and there are all sorts of graphs and whatnot. There are all sorts of individually headed articles. I loved it. I have a number of books like this. Just reading about wild canids. That's all. Reading about what they do, where they are, what we know about them, how we know it, what we infer. And also reading a large amount in here on the species of wild canid that I have never met and will never meet. I will never meet a dingo. There's a whole species of wild canid in this world that I have never met. I've met all the others and face smooch with them, but not dingoes. So I gave that an extra amount of time too, but it's not exactly a gripper. Then this next one, I've been living with this set since I got it. I am determined to write about it somehow. This is the latest box set of Tolkien. I didn't want to haul the box set up here on camera. But this is the Silmarillion. This is the Unfinished Tales, and this is the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2. With illustrated covers, no illustrations on the inside, no inset cloth bookmarks on the inside, no nothing like that. This is just a reprint of those books, but lovely. An absolutely lovely box set. The Tolkien estate comes out with an item like this about once every year, maybe twice every year. Last year were a couple of terrific things, and this is terrific as well. For instance, if you have a huge Tolkien library, I don't know that you could justify the expense of this thing. But I didn't have the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2 except as ebooks. So to have them in this box, I don't want to examine how many copies of the Silmarillion this means I have. I don't know how many it is. I might have 15 copies of the Silmarillion in different editions, different sizes and shapes and whatnot. But I gave this a good old-fashioned earnest try. Despite the fact that this stuff is really familiar to me, I avoided rereading the Silmarillion successfully. I told myself at the beginning, you cannot justify another read of the Silmarillion this year. You cannot do it. And I kind of told myself that about the Unfinished Tales as well, so I concentrated a lot on the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2. I read a lot in the Unfinished Tales in this set, but I concentrated on those last two books. So I think I can include this in my Friday reads. I mainly I got a lot out of it. What a weird and wonderful experience this is. The Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2 especially is not accessible at all unless you're a Tolkien fan, and not just a Tolkien fan, a Tolkien fanatic. The Unfinished Tales, there are segments of the Unfinished Tales where there are stories that go on and that will work. And the Silmarillion is wonderful. Once you get into it, once you agree to its terms, it's wonderful. But the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2, no, they're for fans only. And I'm a fan. And I just made my peace with that and was digging into them, figuring out all the different byways, the roads not taken. That's a lot of what you get, is Christopher Tolkien just excising, giving you as much of his father's working materials as possible. So I think there's a marked difference between the two of the four books here. The Unfinished Tales, they have variants with their versions that are in the Silmarillion, but they're still fairly finished. And of course, the Silmarillion is fairly finished, and then there's The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So the Unfinished Tales, to an extent, the Silmarillion especially, and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are the legendarium. I myself would be hesitant to include anything in the Book of Lost Tales 1 or 2 in the legendarium, because it's all raw material. It's being worked into existence, so it surely can't count. But I loved it. I loved the experience. And I know there are some of you out there who will be wondering this, so I will be sure to tell you that the box set survived. I was very, very careful with it, and it survives. It is still in one piece. And I mean it to survive, because if I do weaken and read the Silmarillion again this year, I want to read it in that box set, since the publisher was kind enough to send it to me. Then we have another reread from years ago. I can't remember if I ever reviewed this. This is by Alex Storozinski, and it's called The Peasant Prince. It's a biography of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who had children's books written about him, had popular histories written about him. This is the first biography of him in 100 years, I think. He has a statue on the border of of the Public Garden here in Boston, because he was hungry for glory, and sought conflagrations like the American Revolution to see if he could hear gunfire, to see if he could be in the presence of shots fired in anger, and also to nominally to lend his cause to independence movements. He's a fascinating figure. There was a biography of him written in the late 19th century that was at an old library of mine once upon a time. I read that and loved it. Thought it might actually be worth a novel. Not the children's books, but an actual novel. I think his life might be worth a novel. Maybe this biography is really good. Maybe this is the closest we need to get. I certainly wasn't left wanting for anything. So it was great. It was great to revisit young Tad. Then we have M.J. Troe is the author here. M.J. Troe has written a lot of murder mysteries. I strongly recommend M.J. Troe's murder mysteries starring Christopher Marlowe. They're really good. I've read, I think, all of them, and I've loved them all. Wish I had them all, even as ebooks. I don't think I have anything by this author. Other than this book, which I read. This is nonfiction. This is The Killers of the Princes in the Tower. A new suspect revealed. I won't spoil this by giving you the author's conclusions. And it's not technically a new subject. All the subjects are well known. This book is more meaning to throw the weight of suspicion on one person above all others. A minor name. If you'd studied the killing of the princes in the tower, you would know this name, but you might not have considered them a suspect. It's all balderdash, of course, as I've gone over on this channel many times. It was Richard who killed his nephews. He might have used an intermediary, but he's the one who made it happen. He's the one who ordered it to happen. He's the one who covered it up. If you have a man who has two little boys between him and the throne of England, and the little boys die, that man is guilty. Okay, as simple as that. The only way you get involved in conspiracy theories about the princes in the tower is if you check your understanding of basic human nature at the door. And you might not want to do that. but this still makes for thrilling reading. Even so, I read every book on the Princes in the Tower. There were a couple last year that made the rounds. They made news. They made documentaries. I read every book on this subject just to see what authors will do with it. Because apart from the dead bang certainty that Richard is guilty, it's fascinating to watch people sift history. As I've said many times before on subjects like the Princes in the Tower or anything else, these are ultimately questions of how do we know what we know? What inferences can we legitimately draw from our materials? I love that. I love watching that happen when somebody does a really good job, and Troe does a great job here. So it doesn't matter whether I agree with it or not. Then another reread. This is Stephen Norwood. I forget when this came out. I don't remember if I wrote about it, but this is the Third Reich in the Ivory Tower. A study of how American academia responded to the Nazis. That is pretty damning, not only to the Nazis, but to American academia. I loved it. Just loved it. A little bit on the dry side, but I liked it. As far as I can recall, I liked it a lot more this time than I did the first time that I read it. I don't know if that's because I'm better informed about the rise of the Third Reich and about their international reputation, or whether or not I liked it more because I live in 2024. It could be that this is not an academic subject for me anymore, and in a way that it was when I read this the first time. I don't know what the reason was, but I really enjoyed the reread. And then we can finish up here as I've gone long again. This is Carlos Lozada, and this is the Washington book. It's really a terrific cover. It's the Washington Monument composed of books, and it's an anthology of his periodical writing. Political pieces, political profiles, a little bit of literary stuff. Very enjoyable. He is a very enjoyable writer. I'm basically on the Carlos train now. So if he comes out with another book, I will read it. I read his big book from a couple of years ago that I just loved about Trump literature. I could have written a book like that myself. I couldn't have written of one as well as he did. Mine would have been far angrier and therefore far less reliable. This was terrific. A lot of these things I'd never seen before. So there you go. That is a kind of Friday Reads, right? That's a kind of Friday Reads. It's all sorts of stuff that I've recently read. I once again neglected all the stuff that I'm going to read, and I didn't get all the stuff that I've read. I read about molds and mushrooms. I read about the Great Auk. I read the Lost Letters of Martha's Vineyard. I read and still am reading the cases of the Taft Court and a bunch of other stuff. But I gave you some highlights here just to get the ball rolling. Because, of course, when it comes to Friday or weekend reads, what I want is to hear from you. What are you working on? What are you reading? I love seeing BookTube videos along those lines. But I love hearing the comments anyway, even if you don't have a BookTube channel. So let me know how the week has been. Was it a really good reading week? Mine was fantastic. Oh my God, fantastic. I realized years ago that Frida really doesn't have the same kind of setup as bigger dogs do. She has a very different relationship with food and water and a tiny, tiny little bladder. So she can go forever without needing to go outside, without needing to take a break at all. And the older she gets, the more she prefers that. Which means that I can get huge and uninterrupted stretches of time for reading, and I've just been increasingly taking advantage of that. So this was a great reading week for me. What about you? Well, I imagine real life has more of a potential to intervene with you than it does with me, so let me know. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube. I was just talking about you, baby. I was.